Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. It's been 50 years since the kidnapping of Patty Hearst, an heir to the Hearst Publishing Company, by the Symbionese Liberation Army, a left-wing radical group that performed bank robberies, kidnappings, and assassinations during the 1970s. Today we're going to be in conversation about this history with a journalist who covered the kidnapping at the time and has continued to follow the story ever since. That guest is Roger D Rapport. Roger Rapport is an award-winning author, filmmaker, and playwright. He's the author of many books. His latest is a novel. It's called Searching for Patty Hearst. It's a novel that actually explores all the different perspectives when it comes to this story and what actually happened. Roger Rapport, it's my good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
It's great to be with you. Thanks.
We've always heard about this story. My home radio station, KPFA in Berkeley, is linked to this story. The Symbionese Liberation Army would send its audio communiques to the radio station and others as well. But this radio station specifically did receive communiques. And I want to talk more about that in a moment. But I've always wondered, and we hear about the kidnapping of Patty Hearst a lot, but rarely do I see a good explanation of who was and what was the Symbionese Liberation Army. What was the SLA?
Well, it was one of the small leftist groups here in California. It was formed in 1973 by an escaped Soledad convict who'd also served time in Vacaville and other prisons named Donald DeFries. And he quickly linked up with a group of Bay Area leftists, some of whom had been part of a Black Cultural Association, which is, they were activists working for prison. They were in the prison reform movement. So they knew Donald DeFries from Vacaville and also Soledad. And some of them were students, but the one thing they had in common was they were anti-war activists. They worked in the Berkeley Library and a lot of other places, but some were students who'd come out here and gone to Cal. But the one thing they all had in common was that they knew Donald DeFries, and they got off to a very bad start. There was a much loved superintendent of Oakland schools who was assassinated by the SLA and in the fall of 1973, primarily because DeFries himself was worried about a couple of things, very worried. Basically, there was a LEAA, the Justice Department, the law enforcement administration, had given a grant to begin working on basically a program to profile students who would be the most likely to get into criminal activities. So that was one concern. The other thing was metal detectors and an ID system carding the students. So he felt very strongly that Foster, who was, I think, the first Black superintendent in the Oakland schools.
That's what I have in my notes, Marcus Foster.
Right. And that he was somehow part of a conspiracy to basically profile students and begin tracking them. And as a Black convict who served a lot of time, this really hit a nerve with him. So after that after that kidnapping, two suspects that were SLA members, Joseph Romero and Russell Little, were arrested. And at that time, there was a safe house in Concord, which other SLA members tried to burn down, but there was a lot of records that didn't burn. And in the recovery, both by police and the press, they found a lot of information about the SLA, particularly their hit list, which had a long list of corporate executives and so on. But one person on that list was the head of the Department of Corrections, Raymond Precunier. So they quickly shifted their strategy and decided, as these younger people began joining the group, they were now a group of 8. Two members were in jail, so there was really 10, but 2 were in San Quentin waiting trial for the murder of Foster. They quickly decided that they had to shift their tactics. So they looked at the Tuparemos and other groups and realized that one thing about kidnapping media-related people is you get more coverage. So they saw an engagement notice for Patty Hearst and her fiancé. They were living on Benvenue in Berkeley. very close.
In this notice published their address, right?
Right, exactly. And what happened was the SLA read the engagement announcement, which appeared in the Hearst newspapers. Patty, who's an art student, a sophomore, and Steve Weed, her fiance was a philosophy, a graduate student working toward his PhD. And they decided on February the 4th, this week, 50 years ago, to kidnap Patty Hearst. Believe it or not, even though she was a Hearst, the security was very minimal. And all they had to do was basically Angela Atwood, one of the members, who's an actress, in addition to being a leftist activist, knocked on the door and said she was having car trouble. Could she use the phone? And within minutes, Patty was in the trunk of a car heading up Grizzly Peak to Tilden Park, where she was moved to another vehicle and went to Daly City, where she was held in captivity for the next 5 weeks. And Weed was badly beaten. He went to Alta Bates Hospital, and then when on release, went to the Hearst home in Hillsborough to begin working with the FBI and the family to try to figure out a ransom plan. It turned into a disaster. The SLA demanded that $70 worth of free groceries were given to everybody in California that couldn't afford, basically, to living paycheck to paycheck but not having enough money for food. It was a disaster. People got attacked. There was basically a riot. So
that's when they actually did the food distribution. I mean, they were going pretty.
And it got even right. Free food distribution. There were just all kinds of problems. They ran out of food. Some of the food was bad. It had gone bad. There was robberies going on. People got attacked. So this was just really a fiasco. But more to the point, we live in a world now where billionaires have tremendous influence. We've seen this all over the world. At that time, there weren't that many billionaire families, but the Hearsts were one of them. So essentially, the ransom demand, which started at $4 million and then went up to $6 million and so on, things just kind of fizzled. And the problem was that the FBI, the governor, who, by the way, in a speech, Governor Reagan said he hoped that the people that got this free food, he wouldn't mind if they came down with botulism, because he was so against any type of ransom. And it got to the point where the Hearst Corporation, which basically controlled the finances of the entire organization and the families, basically said that they weren't going to go ahead and ransom her because they were worried that this would trigger more kidnappings and possibly attacks on companies like the Hearst Corporation, including something like beloved San Simeon, now a state park, but the family still visited there. They had a cottage and so on. So as a result, Randy Hearst her father was pushed into a very difficult situation. So the family, the authorities, the governor, and so on were opposed to paying this ransom, which was really petty cash for $1 billion company. He could have borrowed the money probably, but he took a different approach. He decided to go back channel, talk to a lot of leftist groups, like the American Indian Movement. He went to talk to the prisoners, people who gotten out, parolees, people who knew the SLA, to see if they could put some pressure on the SLA. By this point, the left didn't quite know what to do with the SLA. The Foster attack was a disaster. Jane Fonda, Angela Davis, Ramparts Magazine that I worked for, ran an editorial. I mean, there was just criticism from every corner of the left. So as a result of that, they weren't exactly booming. And now two of their charter members were in San Quentin, and now they kidnapped Patty Hearst. So as you know, KPFA and KPFK were two of the principal media routes, where communiques came out. And of course, these communiques were immediately front page news, a national story. Remember, this is at the end of the Vietnam War period. There was an energy crisis. There was a war in the Middle East, and there was Watergate going on all during this time. So you can understand there was a president that, he was facing impeachment. Sound familiar, right? Anyway, in the middle of all this crisis going on, the coverage that originated in your radio station in KPFK. Patty's first one was, "Mom, Dad, I'm okay. I have a few scrapes." And then later there were much more dramatic statements. They all made the front pages of the Examiner.
Statements of being radicalized, statements in support of the group that she was, the SLA, she was kidnapped.
So here's what happened to Patty. She knew her parents had the money. That was obvious. And she knew they weren't paying the ransom. And to make matters even worse, from the family's point of view, as they began, Patty was not a political really at all. She'd only had one job in her life. She'd worked at Capitals for a few months, but in Oakland in the department store. But other than that, she'd never really worked. They were living on her money. She was buying the groceries. She was doing the cooking. She was cleaning up. And Steve, kind of showed up for dinner with his friends. It was a kind of a difficult situation because she had met Steve when she was 16. He was a high school math teacher at her school, Crystal Springs School for Girls in Hillsborough, now Crystal Springs Upland School. And they began their affair when she was a junior in high school. And then she finished at Menlo College and then moved on to Berkeley with him. But Steve was kind of a Hearst in waiting, but it was a very difficult situation. Her mother was opposed to the marriage. Now she was having doubts about it. She was even having dreams, as we found out later, about the possibility of being kidnapped. So one thing that became clear, there were now 6 women and 3 men in the SLA. And one thing that became clear in her communiques was she didn't say a lot about Steve. And that was kind of the opener for some changes that were going on.
Her
and
fiance.
Ultimately, when her family decided not to go ahead with the ransom, the SLA said, "Well, listen, you can go home." Donald DeFries gave her a gun, said, "You can just walk." They realized with all the heat coming on, and they weren't going to get the ransom money anymore. That was obvious. So they decided she was becoming a liability. But during this process, she realized that if she walked, there was a possibility that, given the fact that the area was flooded with FBI agents and police looking for her, that it was possible she could get hurt one way or another by a trigger-happy cop or whatever, because they knew they were being stalked. And of course, with her there, they knew the chances of being attacked were even greater. So she decided, in a communique actually written and released on April Fool's Day, that she was going to stay and fight with the SLA. And turned out she had weapons training from the SLA, but her father had actually taught her how to shoot a gun. So she wasn't afraid of having weapons around. And more to the point, she announced that she'd fallen in love with one of her kidnappers, Willie Wolf, who was had been a UC Berkeley student, and that she was dumping Steve. So by this point, people have been praying for her, people have been donating money to the ransom campaign, to the Hearst, and so on. As they began reading her communiques, remember, she wasn't a leftist activist at all, but she had grown up in a very wealthy family. So she had a kind of an insider's view of the privileged life of the Hearsts. And remember, this isn't just any media family. This is the original media dynasty created by her famous grandfather, William Randolph Hearst, best known probably in the film Citizen Kane. But as a newspaper publisher, he basically figured out something critical to the success of the Hearst organization, was that, above all, damsel in distress, especially young white women's stories, played beautifully. And he never ceased to run this kind of story, up to and including a story where he sent a reporter to Cuba to actually liberate a young woman, bring her home, and write a series about that. So these stories were always circulation magic. So now the tables had been turned and flipped. And to make it even worse, her parents were fighting now because her mother, after this communique I told you about, where she decided to stay and fight, actually went in front of the press that was camped out on the front porch and the front lawn of her family home, and said, "I don't think Patty actually did that communique. I think it's fake." This is before the AI era, but they were convinced that somehow they were faking her voice. she was convinced that Patty was dead, and they were so horrified they didn't know what to do. They just decided to get away from this media circus and all the crazy swamis who've been giving them advice and psychics and so on. And they flew to Mexico to cool out with Desi Arnaz in Mexico. So all of this, she accepted a new appointment from Governor Reagan, the same Governor Reagan who said he hoped the people who took the free food were going to die of botulism. She took a 16-year appointment, a second appointment on the Board of Regents at UC Berkeley, her school. So that really horrified Patty. So she began issuing these really articulate statements laying out exactly what the SLA had been trying to say, which is that these handful of media dynasties and large corporations, have made it impossible, for the poor, to basically, they end up fighting wars, they get drafted, the whole Black Lives Matter movement, but especially feminist issues. And she was very articulate about that, particularly in her relationship with Steve. I think the women in the organization, in the SLA, they had long conversations about this. So everything that we're talking about now, the Dobbs decision and so forth, she anticipated. And I want to make this really key point. One of the things that they kind of got laughed at was these big companies, what they're going to do is they're going to automate you out of your jobs with robots. Everybody just thought this was crazy. Well, look what's happening right now in tech companies with these large layoffs, with AI and so forth. So a lot of what she was talking about really hit home, especially with women who understood her concern about her relationship with this guy, her teacher. And now she was thinking, I'm not sure that that's the kind of life I want to live in. And she even said at one point to Steve, I wish I'd met you 10 years later because you had so many experiences and I'm not going to have that opportunity to, get to know all these, have all these lovers and so on, that you've had, that kind of thing.
So there's a lot to unpack there, but I do want to come back to the SLA just for a moment.
Sure.
The Symbionese Liberation Army, I believe the word Symbionese comes from symbiosis, which was meant as they were a symbiosis of all the different leftist causes into one that this group wanted to be the vanguard for.
Right.
However, it's these violent acts. It's the assassination of Marcus Foster, a black superintendent of Oakland Public Schools, and other things, including this kidnapping by Patty Hearst, that would ostracize them from the left movement in the Bay Area. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah. And then, would we consider them Marxists?
Well, they were reading Marx to Patty when she was blindfolded in the closet where she was hidden. Willie Wolf was reading to her, and then ultimately they were giving her text, dialectical materialism and so forth. But philosophically, I think what made them relevant was their ability to get airtime. So we've seen this again and again. Whoever controls the microphone in politics basically has the upper hand because, they get a lot better airtime. But this is before social media. So they were using KPFA. They were using the front page of the Examiner, the evening news. They knocked Watergate off the front page. So why did this story become the biggest news story, of its time? Why does it resonate today, 50 years later? And the reason is that a lot of what Patty was talking about, forget about the SLA, a lot of what Patty was talking about resonated especially with women because she was very articulate on women's issues. Now, she hadn't been political, but she'd had her doubts about getting married because she saw herself losing her identity. So it was a very personal thing. So she'd gone in a very short period of time from her family to Steve Weed, now to Willie Wolf. And this is where it starts to get interesting because Patty decided with the SLA that people were saying, oh, she's been brainwashed, this is crazy. The Stockholm Syndrome had literally just been invented. That bank robbery in Stockholm was a year earlier. But people now talk about it, but actually it was invented the year after she was kidnapped, the first time it appeared in the literature. But the point is, she was raising
the Stockholm syndrome when you are the claim that you've been brainwashed, basically.
Well, it's a little more complicated. You basically it's trauma bonding. It's a form of trauma bonding. It's even more complicated than that. Essentially, what happens is you identify with your kidnappers, and you become, you link up with them, and then, in the case of Willie Wolf, that could be considered trauma bonding. But the point was, the public said, oh, they're holding a gun to her head. Obviously, she's being forced to do this, because they're using her as propaganda. Well, so to make it clear that this wasn't true, Patty joined a bank robbery. She didn't just join a bank robbery. She went on camera, in front of the camera, to make sure that she was recorded, and then issued a statement, through public radio.
This is the Hibernia Bank in San Francisco?
Yes, right. Owned by the father of a childhood friend. And after that, they went to Los Angeles and hid out there, where DeFries had a lot of connections. And at that point, they divided into three different teams, three-person teams, because they realized they couldn't all be together. And they had put Patty together with Bill Harris, her kidnapper, and his wife. And they went shopping one morning at a sporting goods store in Inglewood. Basically, Bill was being tackled by security guards. And Patty, who was hiding in the back of a van on the floor, realized what was going on, could hear the commotion and screaming and stuff, and jumped up and fired off an M1, which she had been trained on, and then a machine gun, and let off about 80 rounds. Bill escaped, but the van was hot, so they had to carjack a 17-year-old teenager with his van. So Patty was now a kidnapper. And meanwhile, back at the SLA safe house, the parking ticket on that van gave the police a link to where the SLA was hiding out. They'd moved, but it was too late. They were surrounded. And in the biggest firefight on American soil, 9,000 rounds, 6 of the SLA members, DeFries, Willie Wolf, and 4 of the women, died. And they watched that. They happened to be hiding out in Anaheim across from Disneyland and saw that on television. So now Patty realized that this fear she had of turning herself in wasn't just some, imaginary thing. Hi, I'm Patty Hearst. Oh yeah, well, welcome. We'll take you back to mom and dad. She now realized that she was potentially a wanted felon. Her picture was now up on post office walls all over the country and so on. So she was reluctant to turn herself in. So instead, Jack Scott, who was a Berkeley activist, head of the Institute for Sport and Society, posed as her husband with his parents, posing as in-laws. They fled to Pennsylvania. They also spent some time in New York. And then eventually she came back, was involved in 2 bank robberies in the Sacramento area, including one where Emily Harris's gun discharged accidentally in a woman bringing in church collection, Myrna Opschel, died. So now she'd been in 2 bank robberies. She'd kidnapped Tom Matthews, and on September 18th of 75, she was arrested on the same day with the Harrises. She was ultimately tried in San Francisco, lost that case, was sentenced to 7 years, and served 22 months before her sentence was commuted by President Carter, and later she was pardoned by Bill Clinton in his last act as president in 2001.
This is Letters in Politics, and we are talking about the SLA kidnapping of Patty Hearst we're now looking at the 50th anniversary of that act. Our guest is Roger D Rapport. Roger Rappaport's award-winning author, filmmaker, and playwright. He's the author of many books, including his latest, which is called Searching for Patty Hearst. It's actually a novel that explores the different perspectives to the story in a novel format. Talk to me about that, Roger Rapport. Is this whole issue of whether Patty Hearst had this Stockholm syndrome at the heart of these different perspectives?
Yes, and as you know, the real question is, was she a victim or was she a terrorist? And in Searching for Patty Hearst, I give her and everybody else a chance to tell their side of the story. Now, remember, Patty has written a 400-page book about this, which was central to a movie that came out, a Paul Schrader film, and then ultimately to the pardon, because this made the case that she was a victim. However, many other people, including the jury in her bank robbery case, have taken a different view of what actually happened. So if you read the various sides of the story, you'll get very convincing information from everybody involved. So I had an opportunity to write a book. I was on page 275 in Berkeley with Steve Weed, who was living in my house.
You were very close to her fiance during.
Yes, he lived in my house in Berkeley, on Woolsey Street for about over 4 months. And we wrote a book for Ballantine. And when we got to page 275, he decided that the book was a little too forthcoming and decided to go ahead and pay me off, bought back his rights, published his own book. He kind of rewrote it, took out some things that he felt like, Patty saying, well, we went on a roots trip to Atlanta. My mother used the N-word right and left. How he helped her cheat on a geometry exam by stealing a final from the geometry teacher's file, the one he used every year, because Patty was struggling in that case. A lot of stuff that he just felt, particularly, if he was going to be a Hearst and she came back at some point and decided to marry him. By the way, she never spoke to him again. They never saw each other again after she got out. So subsequent to that, I interviewed Tom Noguchi, the coroner in Los Angeles, best known for Marilyn Monroe, Bobby Kennedy, Janis Joplin, and the 6 SLA members. Remember, when they did that autopsy after the firefight, the house was an inferno. So the bodies were burned, and nobody knew if Patty was one of the 6 victims. The family had to wait until he could do the autopsy. So I interviewed him. Then I interviewed Bill Harris, the kidnapper, at great length for the Oakland Tribune, his first interview after he got out of jail. He went to jail in 1978, got out 5 years later. In that case, and I did a long interview with him. In addition to that, the trial judge in Patty's kidnapping case in Los Angeles with Tom Matthews, this was a 17-year-old that they kidnapped overnight, and Patty was really good to him. He felt that as a fellow kidnapped victim, she really understood what he was going through. She kind of rubbed his back, kept him comfortable. When they released him in his dad's van, after holding him overnight, she gave him a big kiss. So she was a kinder, gentler kidnapper. The judge in that trial, where she pled no contest and got a suspended sentence, basically, was my grandmother's brother-in-law. So I have a lot of connections, and I've continued to report. Up to this week, I had a Washington Post story tied to the publication of Searching for Patty Hearst. And in that story, I interviewed Bill Harris again. So he talked a little bit more about the case. But what I think it's important to your audience and to anybody who's followed this case is to understand that when 2 people are in the same room at the same time, with listening to the same events, or in this case, 9 people in the same Daly City hideout for 5 weeks, people can come away with different versions of what happened. I'll give you an example. So Patty wrote at great length in her book about Jack Scott, the guy that may have saved her life after the LA shootout. She was on the run, and if she'd gotten picked up, who knows? And he risked his own life, risked going to jail. And his parents got involved, posing as the in-laws on this cross-country trip. And Patty wrote about this experience. And Jack sued her over that because he said her version of what happened was completely part of her legal case with F. Lee Bailey, her judge. But younger people in particular who don't remember the case, it's important to realize that you have to pay attention, and this is what the book does. Everybody gets their chapter, so to speak. Steve gets a chapter, Patty gets a chapter, the kidnappers, and so on. They all tell their stories, with the idea being that it's up to the reader to make up their mind. And the point is, you can't just take one person's version of what happened as the gospel. Stress affects memory. And you have to balance, and this is what KPF is, why you have a successful station, is that you present both sides. You give everybody their chance to talk, and then let your listeners decide who's telling the truth. And that's what Searching for Patty Hearst does.
Tell me about Patty. Well, actually, let me back up, because just telling this story is complicated in itself. I mean,
Right.
hasn't the Hearst Corporation tried to control how the story has been told over time?
Absolutely. But you have to understand something really, really important that I've learned as a journalist covering this story over many years, which is Steve Weed sat in my house, lived with me. We wrote a book together. He ate with us, room and board, everything. And every day he would go out and do interviews, talk to the family, come back. I'd write it up verbatim. And then when it came time to publish, he wanted to engage in strategic omission. That is, he wanted to tell the story, but he didn't really want to get into his dealings, get your weed from weed as a drug dealer when he went to Princeton. He didn't want to do that story. So he wrote a sanitized version of the book, took it back to the same publisher, and they rejected it because they wanted to know everything, even things that weren't particularly favorable to him or to the Hearst family. The Hearsts have done something one better. Right now, this is the golden anniversary of certainly one of the most famous criminal events in California history and one of the most famous kidnappings ever. And in response to not just the media like you and me, but the Hearst reporters who have tried to get comment from the Hearst family or any of the people, not just Patty, but anyone, relatives who were involved in this. And the official Hearst stance is no comment. So there you go. So there's a lot of questions that people have. I'll give you an example. I was in San Luis Obispo. My wife and I were staying in a place nearby in Morro Bay, and a guy came up to my wife and said, "Oh, we stayed in that room when we were here last time." And then the guy identified himself. He'd worked at the Hearst Ranch in the stable, and he was the horseshoer. He was the guy that horseshoed the Hearst, the Hearst horses. And he told my wife that Patty Hearst had hid out in one of the cottages at the ranch during her flight time. Okay. Well, have you ever read that before? I'd never heard that before. But think about the implication of that. How on earth did she get into a Hearst cottage when the whole FBI, I mean, they were flying in agents from all over the country in this desperate search to find her? She's staying on Hearst property during her flight. I don't know, not with the SLA. I mean, that's a pretty sensational fact. I know it's true because this guy worked there, and that's the kind of thing I'd love to hear from anybody in the Hearst organization.
Why do you think they're so secretive still about this story 50 years later?
I mean, I'd like to just know from anybody at the time who was there. Why didn't they just call the cops? And say, let's get her out of. But remember, most of the time after the shootout in LA, she wasn't even living with the SLA for a large part of that time. When she was captured, her new boyfriend, Steve Celaya, she was living involved with him and then Wendy Yoshimura, but she wasn't even living with the two surviving SLA members who were, hadn't been arrested yet, the Harrises. So when you ask that question, part of this is what people don't say, and that's what the book does. The book says, well, look, let's agree that a lot of these self-serving accounts or, people who didn't get a chance to cover it or didn't know any of the principles, let's let these people have their opportunity to present their side of the story. And that's what historical fiction does. And that's why this book, Searching for Patty Hearst, is important to younger people, because they need to realize, as you just pointed out, that it isn't just what people say, it's what they don't say, it's what they're not telling you. And that's why KPFA has a worldwide listening audience, because people listen to you because they know what we're talking about right now, which has not been published anywhere else. I mean, I'm learning things I didn't know when I wrote my book, like Patty Hearst hid out in a Hearst cottage at the Hearst Ranch.
People have been reaching out to you since you.
Yeah, there's another guy who reached out to me today. So one of the reasons she lost in court on the brainwashing theory was that there was a report that she had been walking on the San Mateo coast and she was about to climb up a hill, and two rangers said, no, that's too dangerous. They saw this young woman trying to climb a hill, and Steve Celaya, who was with her, said, oh, no, we can make it. No. And they called the fire department, and they actually put down a stretcher, a lift, to lift her up to this church. So now she's on top of the cliff, and there's two park rangers. Hi, I'm Patty Hearst. Take me home, or take me to the police, right? Well, she didn't do that. Well, those guys, that testimony was just devastating. Another thing that really hurt her was Willie Wolf, who she denounced after she was arrested, someone who had attacked her, not really her lover.
But her lover while she...
Yeah, Willie Wolf, the guy that she dumped her fiance for, the guy she never talked to again. Willie Wolf was now, in the words of F. Lee Bailey and Patty, saying, I was abused. I never had anything. I hated him. I just submitted. Well, now it turns out, Bob Scheer, who was an editor at Ramparts, and Susan Lyne wrote a piece for New Times explaining that Willie Wolf had been wearing an Olmec stone monkey carving on a necklace. It turned out Patty had a matching one that he'd given her that was in her purse. So when the prosecutor, James Browning, heard this, he went to the police locker. They found the Olmec carving that she was wearing, that she'd been keeping in her purse for more than a year, about 16 months after he died. So why is she carrying in her purse a love token from this guy who presumably attacked her? You think that'd be something she'd want to throw away immediately? That really hurt her case with the jury. It was just devastating. So these are examples of things that, don't surface.
What is Patty Hearst's version of this story? Does she claim she had Stockholm Syndrome?
She claims that to save her life, she had to do everything they told her to do. And then people say, well, what about all the time when you were alone, not living with the SLA? Why didn't you just walk into a police station? And her answer is that she felt there was a security issue. She was afraid she could get hurt. Remember when I said the family decided not to ransom her on the advice of the FBI and the Attorney General and the governor? Well, it turned out during her trial, when she was revealing information about the Harrises and other, who were also being tried separately, not the SLA, but another group, the New World Liberation Front, bombed San Simeon, a guest cottage, and they were trying for the one where the Hearst stayed as a demonstration. So there was real concern about the safety of the Hearst organization and herself. But her version is that she was forced to do these things, and she took all these actions because she didn't feel safe. The brainwashing argument was really F. Lee Bailey, her lawyer's argument, and then she kind of followed the script, so to speak. And by the way, became an actress for John Waters in some of his films.
This is the time, the early 1970s, of left-wing political violence.
Right.
You have the Weather Underground.
Right.
Interesting time. Why do you think Jimmy Carter commuted Patty Hearst's sentence?
Well, the Hearst organization was phenomenal. The committee to free Patty Hearst was incredibly effective. And then ultimately her book helped her get the pardon. But Carter believed the F. Lee Bailey side of the story, the court version. And they got, a lot of people, Ronald Reagan, the head of the FBI in San Francisco, who moved heaven and earth to try to find her, Cesar Chavez, William F. Buckley, left and the right, they all kind of rallied to her cause. Now, as a feminist, during her SLA time, certainly, there was a very strong argument that she'd been abused and therefore she was a victim, and this argument that lost in court. And by the way, it didn't just lose there. James Browning, who prosecuted her, basically made this case that it simply wasn't true, that she needed to be treated like any other bank robber. When the pardon came up with Clinton, one of the strongest opponents to it was Robert Mueller III. And Mueller at that point was the U.S. attorney, future attorney general, and then the Mueller report in the case against Trump for impeachment. And Mueller just was adamant that she was getting special treatment, that she was arguing that she should get off because she's a Hearst. By the way, part of his thinking was if you can believe this, the head of the court, the judge in her trial, Oliver Carter, knew Patty as a little girl, knew the Hearsts well. And when jury selection time came in that case, the Hearsts were present in a private jury selection hearing, panel. So it wasn't just her parents, it was the Hearsts who were involved in it. So they did get some favors.
We began our conversation talking about Donald DeFreeze, one of the founders of the Symbionese Liberation Army. Donald DeFreeze was a black man, but he was one of only a few, maybe even the only African-American within the SLA.
Correct. He was the only African-American member of the group. Everybody else were pretty much middle-class white kids, with one exception. Willie Wolf's dad was a doctor, so he grew up. He was a little more, he grew up in a pretty affluent family, so he had a little more insight into what Patty was talking about. So remember, in a very short period of time, Patty lived at home, had gone to private school, fell in love with Steve, then presumably, if you believe her statements, Willie Wolf, then Steve Celaya, another SLA member who she was romantically involved with at the time of kidnapping. And then, of course, the F. Lee Bailey team kind of took over her life at that period. So another older white man was involved in basically telling her what to say. And then finally, she fell in love with and married her bodyguard, Bernard Shaw. All this happened in just a few years. That's a lot of transition.
Again, you go through this novel searching for Patty Hearst by presenting, and it's a way to present the different perspectives when it comes to what really happened. After going through all of these, do you have your own take?
Yes, I think it's very clear to me that Patty's story, the one she told, the one the jury didn't buy, has merit in this respect. She understood, as a privileged young woman, what the political point of view was of her captors, and whether or not she voluntarily joined the bank robbery or did this to save her skin. There's no doubt in my mind that she got what they were talking about, and was in her communiques, which Bill Harris told me she wrote better than anything they could have wrote. She said it more clearly, and he felt her insight as a Hearst made her invaluable in terms of getting the word out and telling the world what they were fighting for, trying to inspire other revolutionary groups, particularly on the feminist side. And he also said she was a hell of a shot. In the Inglewood thing, he told me, if anybody was going to cover him when he was trying to escape that security team at the sporting goods store, Patty was a better shot than a lot of the other SLA members. And she really saved his life. So here you go. You've got a kidnapped victim saving the life of her kidnapper. Of course, indirectly, the kidnapper saved her life by taking her shopping. How ironic is that? And it's my view that at the time she was making those statements about what her family didn't do for her, she believed what she was writing. Obviously, nobody wants to go to jail. Everybody in jail has a good story, but because she was privileged and she had the microphone, once she got out, she could make a very convincing case to the jury that everything she had said for a year and a half was a lie. But that didn't work. Those communiques that were on your radio station, everybody knew what she had said, and she did it beautifully. One of the most important ones, the KPFK one, where she eulogized Willie Wolf, the kindest, most gentlest man. That was on Pacific KPFK. I mean, the whole world heard that. She eulogized every member of the SLA, and then suddenly they're all people who attacked her. That you can listen to that today. The Smithsonian has that KPFK tape with images. I mean, you look at that and you think, at the time she was saying that she believed it. Was she brainwashed? Did they force her to do it? Was she just trying to save her skin? That we don't know. I mean, it's a different time. And the point of searching for Patty Hearst is it's up to the reader to decide whether or not she was telling the truth or she was just making up all this information.
This eulogy came after the shootout with the
you got it,
in
yeah,
six
SLA
June
7th,
died.
and it was on KPFK,
yeah.
And it's a piece of history. I mean, it's been viewed millions of times by people trying to figure this out, particularly younger people. And that's what I mean about listening not to just both sides of the story in the sense of Bill Harris versus Patty Hearst. We're talking about Patty Hearst versus Patty Hearst.
Yeah.
She's fighting with herself in the trial, trying to undo everything she said. And the great irony today, the person that really should be on your show today, of course, is Patty Hearst. These are the questions that she's not answering. Okay.
You have not had the opportunity.
No, I'm talking about people who work for the Hearst organization who've been told, not just Patty, but the entire company isn't commenting. Of course, that's their right, but it is a little ironic. And I want to say this about the Hearst. I mean, I write for the San Francisco Chronicle. I've written for Cosmopolitan. I covered the trial, the first part of the trial for her Hearst newspaper. I've written for her cousin's magazine, Outside, which she started. And I admire a lot of what the Hearst journalists do. Kevin Fagan, who writes for the San Francisco Chronicle, is one of the top investigative reporters in the country. He's got a book coming out next year about two homeless people. I've written op-eds for the paper. I'm a subscriber to the Chronicle. So remember this: one of the impacts of all of this was on the Hearst organization, which was very, very conservative in her grandfather's era. And now you've got Will Hearst publishing Alta magazine, which is just a wonderful magazine. The Hearst, the Chronicle does a really good job. So it did have an impact on the Hearst organization, no question.
Roger Rappaport, thank you.
Thank you.
Roger Rappaport.
Thank you.
Roger Rappaport has been our guest. Again, he's an award-winning author, filmmaker, and playwright. He has joined us as this month does mark the 50th anniversary of the SLA kidnapping of Patty Hearst to talk about his new book. It's called Searching for Patty Hearst. You can also find out more by going online at pattyhearst.com.